Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Crombie Radio Hour. I'm just amazed at what's going on within the last couple of weeks and the last couple of days in Ukraine, and it seems like everything has changed with Donald Trump coming to power. So I thought it would be really helpful to check in with Peter Dickinson, who is with the Atlantic Council. He's in Kyiv, Ukraine. He's been on our show before talking about Ukraine, about life in Ukraine, about the war, about Putin, etc. Peter, what do you think's going on, and how's all this, I don't know, negotiations, meetings, statements, misinformation, etc. How's it being played in Kyiv?
Hi, Brian. Well, the mood in Kyiv is one of shock and dismay. I mean, people are very, very alarmed by what they're seeing. They don't know quite how to take it, frankly. There's a certain amount, I think, of people still in denial about where this is going. But overall, the picture is pretty grim, and people expected, of course, they knew, Donald Trump's sympathies for Russia were well known before he was re-elected. I mean, they were known before his first election back in 2016. So there was a lot of trepidation about what might happen in his presidency. But on the other hand, there was also a sense that he would presume, there was a presumption that he would want to project American strength, and so he wouldn't necessarily pressure Ukraine into abandon Ukraine or put Ukraine in a very weak position, because it wouldn't be in America's interests. But now we're looking increasingly at more worst case scenarios. As well as the broader movement in the peace process, which is very, very much in favor of Russia's positions, Russia's wishes. We're also seeing, a lot of very, very shocking and very negative sound bites and quotes and comments from Trump and from people around Trump about Ukraine, attacking Ukraine, criticizing Ukraine, dismissing Ukraine. So overall, a very alarming, very worrying picture.
He says that Zelensky is at 4% in the public opinion polls. What's the truth?
Well, the most recent polls that we have, there were a couple of different polling agencies have come out in the last week or so. One has him, I think, at 62%. One has him at 57%. Ukrainian polling agencies have quite a good record. They tend to be quite close to the mark. Going back for years, if we look at the polling around elections, they've usually been proved quite credible. They're quite close to the reality. So I'm inclined to agree. I mean, of course, it may not be 60, it may not be 57, it may be slightly less, but it's certainly not 4 or 14 or anything like that. I mean, Zelensky is still quite popular. There's a lot of criticism of him, of course, and that is healthy. I mean, that's what you'd expect in a democracy. And I think certainly his domestic policies are a lot less popular than his handling of the war or his international leadership, let's say. But it's clearly ridiculous to try and put out that 4% figure, and that was one of the things I think that alarmed people. That's exactly the kind of thing you'd hear from the Russians, and the sense was, where's he getting this from? Either Trump.
Where does he get this from? Is this
well? I mean, this is the thing. Either he just made it up, which is possible, because I think he does make stuff up a lot, or he was fed it by the Russians. So either of those things is pretty alarming. Probably, the idea that it's coming from Russia would be worse. But that it doesn't seem to be any. There's no credible source for that. He hasn't provided anything. Nobody's provided anything. I think Elon Musk has tried to say it's a reference to some sort of intelligence reports or something. But frankly, it's complete nonsense. There's no credible source whatsoever would suggest it was his rating was anywhere near in the region of 4%. So either it's made up or it's from Russia, and either of those options are pretty scary.
President Trump says that Zelensky is a dictator and has done away with democratic elections. What's the truth?
Well, the whole argument about elections, again, is coming from Russia. There's no question that's coming from Russia. The Russians have been the only people pushing that. Ukraine has, the Ukrainian constitution clearly states that there can be no elections while there's martial law. Now, Ukraine imposed martial law at the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. It remains in place. So Ukraine cannot have elections. Now, Ukraine was supposed to have presidential and parliamentary elections last year. They were scheduled for last year, and they've been postponed. So this is the genesis of the whole narrative of cancelling elections. They weren't cancelled; they were postponed because the constitution doesn't allow them. Now, if we look at this from a practical point of view, it's obvious that it would be impossible to hold elections. Ukraine, around 25% of the Ukrainian population has been either displaced or refugees living abroad. How would they participate in an election? That would be, very, very challenging to involve them. So that's around 11, 12 million Ukrainians. Another 4 million are living under Russian occupation. Again, they can't participate. The entire mechanics of a campaign couldn't happen. You can't have big public meetings in Ukraine because Russia bombs them. Russia has bombed people trying to evacuate from train stations. Russia has bombed funeral gatherings in cafes and restaurants. It's bombed hospitals, schools. So the idea of public gatherings is out. You couldn't have any election rallies. You couldn't have any sort of meet the public, meet the electorate, any town halls or anything like that. And then you have the issue of the election day itself and opening polling stations. Again, you can't, just imagine the situation if Russia bombed the polling station with queues of people inside and outside waiting to vote. A massacre. It's not something that anyone could contemplate. So, legally, Ukraine can't have an election. In practical terms, they can't have an election. So it's really a non-issue. And Ukrainians themselves are not pushing for this. It's not popular. Again, polling shows that most Ukrainians don't want elections, don't think it's necessary now. I think the last poll showed around 63 or 64% of Ukrainians, so around 2/3 say, no, we don't want elections during wartime. Zelensky's political rivals, his political opponents, who would presumably have the most to gain from elections, have come out publicly and said, we don't want elections, we're against it. Civil society. So there's no pressure at all from Ukraine, from the Ukrainians themselves to say, we're being silenced. Zelensky's a dictator. We've had our democratic rights taken away from us. There's nothing like that in Ukraine. This is only coming from the Russians because Russia would like elections as an opportunity to destabilize Ukraine and perhaps remove Zelensky. Russia is very, very good at electoral interference. Now, Putin is not able to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. He's doing, the war is going broadly in his direction, but he's not winning it. Not yet, and his troops are advancing very, very slowly. He needs to resolve this. If he can't beat Ukraine on the battlefield, maybe he can do it at the ballot box. So elections are a very useful tool for the Russians to try and destabilize Ukrainian society, maybe get Zelensky out of the way. And I would assume what they've done here, the Russians have come to Trump's team and said, look, we can have negotiations about some sort of peace deal. We're ready to make some concessions. We need you to make it a condition for America to pressure Ukraine to have elections. Now, of course, they won't talk about why they want this. They'll say, well, we need a legitimate government in Kiev to make a deal with. But Vladimir Putin's never won a legitimate election. He is a dictator. He is recognized as such by almost anyone, any rational observer. So the argument of legitimacy is absurd, frankly, on face, because Putin has no democratic legitimacy. So he has no need for any Ukrainian authorities to have any particular democratic legitimacy. So this is a Russian ploy, but Trump has now taken this up and he's pushing this argument himself, which is, again, another sign that's very worrying for people in Kiev, because everyone in Ukraine understands that this is a Russian narrative and this is part of Russia's plan to somehow achieve victory in Ukraine, which it couldn't achieve via military means.
President Trump says that Ukraine was the cause of the start of the war. What's the truth?
Well, I think even he sort of started to walk that one back a little bit now, because that was. I mean, they're all outrageous lies, but that was perhaps one of the most offensive of all. I think Trump does have a tendency to say wild things in a childish manner, and a lot of the people around him essentially advise, like, don't take what he says too literally. I think this is a case of that, where he was lashing out at Zelensky because Zelensky had annoyed him by defying him over this minerals, natural resource deal that Trump wanted Ukraine to sign. Zelensky didn't do so. He actually stood up to Trump and defied him, and so he sort of lashed out with this blaming Ukraine for starting the war. I don't think even his closest people take that very seriously. I think it's well known, and it's almost universally, I would assume, accepted that Russia started this war. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has never had any aggressive intention towards Russia, and why would it? I mean, that would be insane for a country as relatively, comparatively weak compared to Russia as Ukraine to have some sort of a military ambitions or aggressive intent towards Russia. That's clearly nonsense. So I think, again, this was another very worrying signal, but perhaps not as worrying as the others, because that's so ridiculous. It just seemed like a sort of tantrum, a toddler tantrum, saying something ridiculous. Whereas the other comments and the calls for elections suggested that he was literally reading from the Russian script, reading from the Kremlin script.
Why is the president of the United States having toddler tantrums and reading from a Russian script?
Well, I mean, we can speculate about all sorts of different motivations here. I mean, I think part of it was, there's a personal factor here. I think he and Zelensky got involved in a kind of war of words in the last few weeks, which has escalated. And part of that I think part of that, the responsibility does lie with President Zelensky, that while he could justify what he did and what he said in terms of defending himself, Trump is someone who does not respond well to any sort of hostility or criticism. He lashes out, and this is exactly what we've seen these last few weeks. He's lashed out very, very, very strongly and very viciously, I would say. He didn't take that well, but I think he is inclined to want to pressure Ukraine rather than Russia. Ukraine is obviously the weaker of the two partners. Ukraine is very dependent on Russia, on America. It requires American support for its survival. And so I think Trump's looking at it, and his instinct is, okay, well, I'll pressure them because they're much easier to pressure. With Russia, it's going to be a much tougher contest. The Russians can strike back. They can create problems for me and for America. It's much easier for me if I want to make this deal, which I've promised everyone I'm going to make. It's much easier for me to bully Ukraine into concessions than it is to try and get Russia to actually behave in a more reasonable manner. So I think that's there's a pragmatic factor here. I think Trump also views Russia as a natural partner for America. He likes the idea of great powers getting together and deciding the fate of the world, and he certainly sees Russia as a great power. He would like Russia and China and America to be dominant forces in the world deciding things, and we see this by the fact that he's looking to basically exclude Europe entirely from the negotiating process. It's just America and Russia sitting down head to head, superpowers, with Ukraine in a sort of secondary role, receiving information from the American side. These about what's been decided or what's been discussed, and Europe is completely excluded. So this also, I think, this speaks to the sort of worldview of Donald Trump. He wants to have these big guys at the table talking. It's much easier for him to bully Ukraine than it is with Russia. He's got natural sympathies with Russia. Of course, we can go down the road of talking about what the realities of the relationship with Russia is. Trump has a very complex and very, I would say, suspicious relationship with Russia, but that is very difficult to prove decisively or conclusively. I think we can look at what we know for sure. We know for sure that he's had a long-term relationship in business with Russia. There've been incidents of Russians have been very big clients of his, have bought real estate from him at inflated prices, have been involved in a lot of his business projects. He spoke publicly often about his admiration for Russia. He traveled to Russia as the Soviet Union in the 1980s for the first time. So he's got a long history with the Russians. He's sympathetic to Russia. I think he genuinely liked to have a good partnership with Russia. He sees it as a very, very profitable partnership potentially. And so Ukraine really gets in the way of that, and he doesn't want to get involved in this confrontation with Russia. He'd much rather bully the Ukrainians into accepting a very Kremlin-friendly or pro-Kremlin peace agreement that will allow him then to, to then move forward with his relations with the Russians.
I just don't see why this, other than maybe honoring his agreement that he's going to be able to solve the war and create peace. I don't see actually how this is any advantageous to the United States or Trump. I'm really frustrated trying to understand that. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Peter Dickinson. I'm going to ask him about this critical minerals issue, which sort of to me sounds like extortion. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Peter Dickinson coming to us tonight from Kyiv, Ukraine, talking about obviously what's going on with peace negotiations, the war, Ukrainian politics, Donald Trump, etc. Peter, where did this, couple billion, 500 billion, 200, 500, I don't even know what the number is, $1 billion worth of critical minerals come from? I hadn't heard about this before. Had anyone talked about, Ukraine paying off the money that the United States had invested in donating and providing munitions to Ukraine before? Is this extortion, or is this lend-lease, or what the heck is this?
Well, the idea actually originally comes from Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian side. Late last year, President Zelensky presented a plan, what he called his victory plan, which is a plan for the country's Western partners, including the Americans. And one of the points of this plan was the joint exploitation of Ukraine's rare earth minerals, its natural resources. Now, Ukraine has a lot of wealth here. The figures vary. You get different numbers put around, but it's a lot. I mean, they've got a lot of very, very valuable natural resources, lithium, titanium, these sort of things, and it's very difficult to exploit this sort of stuff, to get at this sort of stuff. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of technological know-how, and so Zelensky was essentially trying to entice the Americans. I think he had Trump very much in mind. This was before Trump won re-election, but I think he already had him very much in mind, thinking, that this is a way to get this guy engaged, to show that it's profitable for him. So the idea was originally from the Ukrainian side, but Trump's now taken this up. And he's turned it round into a very, very very uneven agreement. Now, the first proposal, which came to Ukraine, I think 2 weeks ago, was presented to Zelensky almost just like a fait accompli. Like there's like, here it is, sign it, just sign it. And when Zelensky's team looked at this document, they were apparently very shocked and horrified, basically, at the terms that were proposed, which were very, very unfavourable for Ukraine. They were essentially saying that America would have, I think, long-term or in perpetuity control over like 50% of a lot of Ukraine's assets. It wasn't just these specific rare earths; it was also oil and gas. It was aspects of the country's infrastructure, like the country's ports. So it was described in some quarters as like the kind of agreement that a European country would make with a colony in Africa in the 19th century, which was essentially a slave agreement, almost a slave treaty, to keep the country, to basically steal the country's wealth. So Zelensky at that time said, no, let's talk about this more. I'm not ready to sign this. And this was one of the factors that sparked all this war of words and all these insults from Trump. And it was basically a tantrum he's thrown, essentially saying, "How dare you?" So it does have the ring of some sort of an extortion racket. They essentially sent their guy to Kiev to say, okay, you need our help, you're desperate, right? We'll sign away your national wealth to us, and then we'll think about it. So the optics were awful, very really ugly, and Ukraine said no. Which I'm sure wasn't an easy decision for them to make. I'm sure they understood that was a risky thing to do, but Zelensky presumably felt he had no option but to do that, clearly. Talks are still ongoing, so we'll see. Maybe they can, you could argue that Trump, this was Trump's first bid in the negotiating process. He was playing hardball. Now, is it appropriate, is it ethical to play hardball with a country that's fighting for survival? I would say probably not. That's not what people normally do. But Trump's not a normal politician. He's looking to get the money. He wanted to have a win for his electorate, to be able to say to them, look at this, I've got a great result here. And presumably, presumably, if he gets the agreement, he can then turn around to his electorate and say, okay, we're providing Ukraine with weapons because we're getting something for it. We're not giving them to them. We're selling them to Ukraine. Essentially, we're getting all these great natural resources. We're getting a great deal. I'm the deal maker. It's the art of the deal. I've made a great deal with Ukraine, and now it would allow him to continue arming Ukraine, perhaps even providing more than they had in the past. So, it's still an interesting proposition, but the terms are, very, very brutal on Ukraine, and that's why it looks so ugly at the moment and has caused so much consternation in Ukraine. And I think a lot of people around the world, and certainly in Europe, are looking and thinking, this is so inappropriate for Trump to try and basically shake down this country, which is facing this fight for its life. So we'll see how that plays out. I mean, it could be very interesting in terms of securing Ukraine the military aid that it desperately needs, but also locking America into having an American interest in Ukraine for the long term. Because these resources take a long time. This is not a matter of coming in and collecting, filling up a load of wagons and then shipping all the stuff out. It takes a lot of time and investment to build the technical capabilities to get at these resources, to exploit them, and that's long term. We could be talking decades even. So if they can find the right terms, if Zelensky can basically negotiate a reasonable deal, could be very interesting. But at the moment, it looks ugly. It looks really ugly.
So I used the description extortion. You did as well. You don't think that that's too far of a description?
No, I mean that's what it looks like at the moment. But you could say it's extortion. It's a mafia shakedown. But you could also turn around and say Trump's a hard-nosed businessman. He's negotiating. This is how he does business, and that's how he's always done business. That's how he was trained. So, maybe we shouldn't be that surprised. He would certainly probably brush off any criticism of that nature. Certainly, that's what it looks like.
When you think about this peace negotiation, it almost seems like if where we're currently negotiating ends up being the end game, it's like we're giving 20% of Ukraine to Russia and 50% of the balance of the resources to the United States. It's like Russia and the United States are carving up Ukraine without Ukraine's consent and involvement.
Yeah, it's basically. I mean, it looks like there's a lot of echoes of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 when they carved up Eastern Europe and then they invaded Poland together and they basically divided Poland in two between them and subjugated the Poles. There are, of course, echoes there, and that again, the optics are awful. But I mean, on the other hand, the resource deal, those resources are not being exploited now. Ukraine would need to have foreign partners to do so. There's a good chance they will be American anyway. So it's not a matter of simply, America would have a share. The negotiation now is what would the share be? Ukraine will have a share as well. Ukraine will have a share of these things that are being exploited once there's access. So it's not entirely comparable with like the Nazi-Soviet pact, but certainly, I mean, it's a really it's been handled in an ugly way, and it looks, it looks terrible. I think from a Ukrainian point of view, certainly, but I think generally from a lot of Americans also are saying, this is not good. And also a lot of it is the Americans saying, or Trump rather saying, we want to get paid for what we've already given in the past. So it's retroactive. So you're saying, okay, so presumably that could apply to a lot of things. America's been providing aid and support to a lot of different countries. Is it going to start turning up elsewhere and saying, oh, we gave you this money 5 years ago for something, now we want to have.
No, that's his attitude toward Panama, isn't it? That's exactly what he's saying in Panama.
Well, yeah, Panama is another example of this sort of conduct. So we'll see. But I think he pushes very hard to try to a hard bargain. Now the real test, and the real test for this will be, we'll see what the end result is and what Ukraine can negotiate. If America walks away and says, well, that's it, it's take it or leave it, this is the deal, as it stands now, yeah, that's extortion. No question.
What's the alternative? Is there an alternative?
Well, I mean, if America were to lose, if Ukraine were to lose American military support, which is what what we'd be talking about here, I mean, that would be the prospect there. That would be a very serious blow to Ukraine's chances to be able to defend itself. And it wouldn't immediately mean they'd have to end the war. America now is responsible for around 30% of all Ukraine's military supplies, they say. So Europe is providing a lot. Some other non-European partners are providing, some aid, and Ukraine is producing more and more military equipment itself. So it wouldn't mean the end. Europe is now, of course, also facing a crisis from Trump's foreign policy, and also coming round to the reality that they now are in a new era where they have to be able to defend themselves. And so they will also be mobilizing their resources, investing more in defense. And a lot of that also can be used to help Ukraine, to support Ukraine. So it wouldn't necessarily be decisive, but of course it would be a huge blow to Ukraine, and it could well mean that we wouldn't be talking about 20% of the country being lost. It could be 50% of the country, for example, or more, at least certainly more. So it's it would be a very, very big blow.
Could Ukraine get the support from Europe if it loses the United States? Is there a deal that he could negotiate with Europe, give 20%, 25% of the critical minerals to Europe to entice them? And Germany, particularly, I think, is the one party that could supply a lot more that hasn't been supplying. What is the alternative, or is there no alternative?
No, it's Europe. Europe is the alternative. I mean, Europe is already stepping up. We expect to see a record European aid package coming through in the next week or so. I would imagine, perhaps in the next month, of around 20 billion euros, which is much larger than anything they've put on the table before. The Europeans are going through a very dramatic period of rethinking their security policies now. They understand that they are now, they can no longer, I think no European country now, after the first month of the Trump presidency, no European country can rely anymore on American support, can take it for granted. Now, that's not to say that America has definitively withdrawn from Europe, but they've sent very clear signals that they plan to step back. And I don't think anyone would take it for granted that America is now going to provide the blanket of security which has been there since the end of World War II. So that means a whole new world for these European countries. They've got to dramatically increase their spending. They've got to dramatically increase their military production, and that's happening. That's got to happen now, I think, after a long period of complacency on the part of the Europeans. I mean, Trump is not wrong saying that Europe needs to pay more. He's right about that, actually. And the Europeans now will have to do that, I think. And a lot of that can be to Ukraine's benefit. They can help Ukraine. Now, there's some things they can't provide. There's some things that America produces that they can't provide, like the Patriot air defense systems, for example, is a good example. But they can provide a lot. They've got the technologies, they've got the finances. They can spend it if they cut back elsewhere. So I think it would. The Europeans can step up. The question will be now: do they have the political will to do it?
There was a newspaper in Canada, not one of the major ones, but a very influential one from our nation's capital, that had about 2 weeks ago, when Donald Trump imposed tariffs or threatened to impose tariffs against Canada in opposition to the Mexico Free Trade Agreement that had been signed by him previously. And the headline was, and it was above the fold, it was in big headlines, Canada can't trust America anymore. Can't trust America anymore. Would that resonate in Europe and in Ukraine?
Well, this is the reality for Ukraine. This is the reality for all of Europe now. It may be the case that if Trump finds that this very aggressive stance that he's taken is not effective or not successful, not good for America, he may want to step back from that, to walk it back. But I think the damage has been done now. Nobody in Europe would now rely on America for their security, and they have done for decades. But they no longer. That's a revolutionary shift that's already happened in the last few weeks. I mean, that's literally
in the last few weeks. people's trust in the United States is gone.
Yeah.
That what you're saying?
Yes, I think it's. I think I mean, of course, there's still. They would still. I mean, the Americans are still engaged, and there are different signals coming out, and there's some American officials saying, no, no, no. Of course, you can still trust us. I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about here is NATO. Would America live up to its NATO obligations if another NATO member were attacked by Russia? That's basically that's fundamentally, this is what we're talking about here. When we talk about European security, and we talk about
threatening to militarily invade another NATO partner, Greenland. They're talking about economic coercion against Canada. How can you possibly have confidence that they would live up to Article 5 of NATO?
Well, that's the thing. I think now I don't think they would have that confidence. I don't think anyone in NATO. So I mean, now we're talking about the discussions have begun now of a post-NATO Europe. What is NATO now? I mean, no one's going to disband NATO. I wouldn't imagine. But is NATO still the alliance that it was 2 months ago? No, it's not. It's clearly not. It's clearly, the Article 5 is an article of faith, essentially. It means, we will all defend any country that's attacked, so you mustn't attack. So basically, if you attack any NATO member, you are attacking America. That's essentially what an Article 5 means. Of course, NATO is an alliance of 27 or 28 countries, but fundamentally, when we talk about Article 5 and why Russia doesn't attack NATO countries, it is because it does not want to have a war with America. Now Trump has put all that in question. So, therefore, NATO loses that sense of certainty. And then the members of NATO must now look for alternative forms of security. So I think we'll see the Europeans looking to form, I'm not talking about a separate NATO for Europe, but they will certainly be looking to form on the informal level very serious partnerships in the security area. We're already hearing, just in the last few days, senior members of senior politicians in Europe, including the man who it's assumed will be the new Chancellor of Germany, talking about sharing of nuclear security with the British and the French. And in Europe, only Britain and France have nuclear weapons. So the Germans are now openly talking, well, we need to speak with them and work out how we can come to some agreements to share that nuclear deterrent with them. Now, I'm sure behind closed doors, in places like Poland, they're also talking about the fact that they need nuclear weapons of their own. They need to have their own nuclear weapons. I'm sure that countries like Turkey are also saying, well, maybe we need nuclear weapons. Outside Europe, if we go into Asia, I'm sure that there are countries in the South Koreans, the Japanese. I'm sure they're thinking, well, the way things are going and the way America's behaving, maybe we need nuclear weapons as well. So I think we're moving into a very dangerous and unpredictable new world. There's going to be a lot of different players. It's not going to be just a couple of big blocks. And one of the things I think we're going to see militarization. We're going to see arms races all over the place. And we're very likely going to see nuclear proliferation on an unheard of scale, where you have a number of countries getting nuclear weapons because they understand that they have to have them now because they can't rely on America anymore.
Well, I fear one of the big lessons of this whole process is that Ukraine should not have given up its nuclear weapons, its nuclear deterrent, and never have trusted that agreement that was signed that said that Russia, Ukraine, U.S., etc., would protect Ukraine if it was ever invaded.
Yeah, well, I mean that's now become notorious as one of the biggest mistakes, or perhaps one of the biggest betrayals in modern diplomatic history. I mean, clearly that was a catastrophic blunder from the Ukrainian side, but of course the Ukrainians could point and say, well, look, we at the time we believed that we were that we got a good deal there in terms of the security assurances they received. Now, Ukrainians didn't really read the small print here, or didn't really believe it. They assumed, I think, far too much that the security guarantees would be solid. As it turned out, they weren't. They weren't treaty guarantees in the true sense. So none of the countries except Russia has technically broken their commitments there. But clearly the spirit of the agreement was that Ukraine would be protected, that its borders would be respected, and that the countries of the Americans and the Brits and the French would help the country make sure that its sovereignty and its territorial integrity was never threatened. So yeah, that was a huge mistake, and now everybody sees that. Now, if you went to another country now, let's say, I don't know, let's say a country in Asia has acquired nuclear weapons, and then there's an effort to try and get them to disarm, to engage in unilateral disarmament, and they're offered some sort of a treaty or guarantees. Of course they're going to say no, and of course they're going to point to Ukraine and say, "Come on, guys."
Once you renege on an agreement and you lose trust, you're never going to be trusted again.
Yeah, I mean, you lose. Trust is like a reputation. You can lose your reputation, you can lose trust in a moment, and it takes decades to earn it.
And you said that the United States has done that in the last 4 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I feel so. I mean, I feel that the Trump administration has purposely sought to reorder the world, the diplomatic, the international, the world of international relations.
But you're describing a far worse result than I think a lot of people. You're talking about militarization, arms race, nuclear proliferation, lack of trust, nuclear arms race. That's what you're saying. The implication of this is.
Well, I mean, I think if you're a country that's close by to Russia, and again, let's take the example of Poland or Germany. They are countries that are close to Russia, that have experience of Russian imperialism, of Russian aggression. They know that Vladimir Putin is a revanchist ruler. He's an expansionist ruler. He's an imperialist. He has ambitions, and the only thing that's previously been containing him has been the idea of NATO's collective security. Now, if NATO's collective security is now taken off the table, they need some other form of reliable defence. Now, I'm not saying they're all going to rush out and get nuclear weapons or even try to. At this page, they might just look to have some sort of partnerships or with those who already have nuclear weapons, the French and the British. Could be they might want to go down that line, but even that I think wouldn't provide the confidence that they need. I mean, this is a life or death issue for nations. They need to have security. And the other factor here, of course, is that we're seeing in Ukraine, Russia has regularly, routinely almost used nuclear blackmail. Putin has again and again since the invasion, since the very first day of the invasion, again and again he's made very thinly veiled nuclear threats, where he's warned that it could, this could go nuclear. I will use nuclear weapons. He's
and they appear to have worked,
and it has worked. It's worked very well. When President Biden was assessing his presidency and sort of signing off at the end of last year, or maybe perhaps early this year, when he was talking about his foreign policy, talking about Ukraine, he talked about he highlighted two things. He said, Ukraine did not fall, which was one big success, and the other big success, we didn't have a nuclear war. So he's basically attributing the fact that he bought into Russia's nuclear blackmail as one of his greatest successes. I would say it was a catastrophic failure because Russia has now learned the lesson that it can use nuclear blackmail to enable the conquest and the subjugation of its neighbours. It can use nuclear blackmail as a tool to facilitate invasions. Now, any country that sees that, I keep using Poland as an example, I don't want to pick on the Poles, but any country that sees that and that's near Russia has surely got to be thinking, well, look, we've got to have nukes. We have to have nukes because these guys use nuclear weapons routinely to blackmail and to menace us and to bully us. And our partners in America aren't interested and they don't want to get involved. So where have they got, what can they do? They have to, so this is, I think
Peter, let's call a spade a spade. Let me ask you the question. If tomorrow Russia rolled over the Polish borders, what do you think the United States would do?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that, frankly, I would say I think it's unlikely they would roll over the Polish border, but it's not completely out of the question. And it's no longer out of the question that they'd roll over the Baltic borders into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which would be probably the first thing they'd try and do. What would they do? I mean, I think there would be there would be a huge hue and cry. There would be a lot of back and forth, a lot of diplomatic meetings. But I'm not convinced that there would be a military response. I am not convinced anymore. A few years ago, I would have said that's out of the question. They would respond very forcefully, very militarily, immediately. Now I think you'd have Americans and you'd have big summits of NATO leaders, and there'd be a lot of condemnations and bold statements. But I think behind the scenes, what you'd see is the West, and especially the Americans, trying to negotiate with the Russians and say, calm down, don't do this, we don't want this. They wouldn't respond strongly. They wouldn't respond with overwhelming military force. I don't believe. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I don't think in the current environment, after what we've seen, we can't take it for granted anymore.
That's pretty sobering. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Peter Dickinson from the Atlantic Council in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Peter Dickinson, coming to us tonight from Kyiv, Ukraine. He's with the Atlantic Council. You've been in Kyiv for what, 2 decades now?
Yeah, more than 2 decades. Yes, it's 25 years.
And working there, and you've got a family there now, and you've become a resident. You're originally from the UK, correct?
Yes. My family's from Liverpool.
Peter, got to ask you, why does this all make any sense? I understand that Trump promised he could end the war. I understand that, frankly, Ukrainians would probably like peace. There have been a lot of people killed, and that's terrible, and cities destroyed, and et cetera. But from a purely American standpoint, you're spending money, yes, but you're effectively using Ukrainian people to weaken your biggest adversary in the world. And the Russian economy has been devastated. The Russian army has been weakened. The Russian military has been proven far weaker. Why is Trump actually strategically thinking about suing for peace in such a way when, granted an expenditure of monies, but for an expenditure of monies, he can continue to weaken Russia at Ukraine's expense, effectively?
Well, I think Trump and the political movement around him are by instinct isolationists. They don't want America to play a global role. They don't want America to be involved really anywhere around the world unless they have to be. That has been their mantra across the board, whether it's Russia or any other involvements. And he's come to power off the back of almost 2 decades of American military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were extremely costly and which effectively had produced no tangible positive results for the Americans. I mean, huge results for the Iraqis and the Afghanistan,is of course, huge toll that they paid for those campaigns, those operations, those wars. But I think that has poisoned the American public's mind against any form of involvement in international conflicts, even when very clearly, American interests and American values are at stake and American alliances. So I think that's an important factor, that Americans just have no appetite for this sort of thing anymore. And the only reason that they were so mobilized initially, I think, was because Russian aggression was such an obvious crime. It was such an obvious black and white issue, and the Americans felt that they had to stand up there, or otherwise, if this was allowed to pass, then the implications, the precedent it would set, would be so disastrous for the international order that American interests would be seriously damaged. But fundamentally, I think that they would love to just get out of all this sort of stuff. I mean, Trump's talking about massive cuts to the American military budgets, the defense budget, and that's a long-term project. And then, of course, if you're going to do that, that means you've got to reduce your involvement around the world in different military areas. You'd have to prioritize. So they're fundamentally looking just to get out of the role of being like the world superpower. Essentially, they want to. I think Trump's vision of the world is a multipolar world where America is one of a number of key powers. So you've got America, Russia, China, perhaps, and then some smaller regional powers who dominate the world and cooperate with each other. Rather than fighting each other or rather than being in competition with each other directly. That's the kind of vision he would like to have. And then with a very significantly scaled down American military. So that's, I think, the rationale behind his approach to the peace process, or the efforts to broker a deal in Ukraine. And he's been quite frank about that, I think, for the whole time, even before he came back to the White House, throughout the war, and certainly during the election campaign. He just wants to end it. He wants to get out, and he's not particularly worried if the end is not very neat and tidy or very honourable in terms of support for self-determination or Ukrainian rights or democracy or human rights or any of these values. Just wants it over, just wants to end it and get out of there and move on.
After World War I, and particularly in the 1930s, the U.S. was sort of similarly inclined, was isolationist, put in place some substantial tariff barriers, was very nationalistic, was not interested in getting involved in wars internationally. And even after the initiation of World War II and the attack on Poland, the United States took another year and a half, a year and 3/4 to get involved until the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they were directly involved themselves. Is that the same situation, that the United States is going to completely remove itself and allow the rest of the world to deal with itself until and unless it's personally attacked?
I think there's certainly parallels. I think because the people today, we've come from we're at the end now, it looks like, or the end period of a prolonged period of American global dominance, and America playing this very prominent role in global affairs. Going back to from 1941 essentially, or let's say 1945, right up to the present day, America has been the number one power, and it's been all over the world, a very, very significant influence in whatever in all geopolitical matters. So we consider that to be, I think, the default, the norm, the sort of natural order of things. But as you say, America has a strong tradition of isolationism. 1920s, 1930s, World War I, same story. Going back into the 19th century, America was not, while Europe was busy building empires all over the world, the Americans really stayed out of all that. There were a couple of colonial adventures they went on. They did set up a few colonies, but they weren't involved in that in the same sense as most West European countries were. Things like the scramble for Africa. America played no part at all in the scramble for Africa, the diplomatic division by the Europeans of the African continent, for example, which took place in like the 1880s and 1890s. America at that time was already a major global economic power, but it didn't get involved. So it has a very strong and long political tradition of isolationism, and it's coming back. That's very much what Trump's all about. That's very much what the ideological aspects of his base. I think some of his base probably wouldn't be very familiar with these ideas, but those who are, and those who are sort of shaping his ideology, they're very much isolationists. And this is what we're seeing. This is exactly the policy we're seeing. So the war in Ukraine, let's end it, and then get out of Europe. Your security is your problem.
So, Peter, if you sat down with President Zelensky tomorrow, what would you tell him? What advice would you give him?
I would say I would advise him to not respond to Trump's childish insults. I would say just don't respond. Just do not get involved. Do not get involved in these tit for tat back and forth, because it's a bad idea. I know it's frustrating and it's annoying and it's offensive, but just don't respond. I think that's the best way to deal with him. Anything else is it's not productive, simply. But I would say, fundamentally, we've got to broaden our options here. Focus on building up defence and security cooperation with Europe to the absolute maximum, and crucially, I think, focus as much as possible on getting Ukraine's international partners, your European partners, and Canada, for that matter, to help Ukraine build up its domestic military industrial complex, and to increase, to really make Ukraine into a sort of frontline frontline fortress for the Western world, for Europe and other partners, where they have the army and where they have the military industrial complex that can help make sure that Ukraine's safe, and that can keep, can play a key role in European security. Because America, of course, it's good to have America on board, but the days where American support was guaranteed are gone. They're gone. We can't count on them.
The days that you could count on American military support are gone. The days that you can mount and trust the United States in trade treaties is gone. They're far more interested in Panama, Greenland, and naming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Gosh, it's amazing what's happened. Peter Dickinson, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, and stay safe.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I've got several shows on this week in regards to what's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Please listen in every night on 9:60 a.m. You can stream online at saga960am.ca every night at 6 o'clock. You can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on briancrombie.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Good night, everybody.